Okay, I think we'll make a start there. So, hi everyone, thank you for joining us for this LMS Good Practice Scheme workshop on research culture. My name's Alex Best, and along with Calvin Smith, we are the new co-chairs of the Good Practice Scheme Committee. So I'd like to start actually by saying a big thanks to our predecessor in this role, Anne Davis, who has organised many of these workshops over the last few years. I think it speaks volumes that it's taken two of us to replace her. So a massive thanks to Anne for everything she's done for this committee. So today's workshop is on research culture. This is obviously a phrase which we're hearing kind of more and more about through official channels. It's something that is definitely feeding into future ref submissions. But I think for all of us, the culture of the place we work is really important to us. And it's something that we should be thinking about how we can improve and how we can make it a more welcoming environment for people from all sorts of backgrounds. So we have four speakers, all able to offer different insights, different angles of thinking about this. We'll have time for questions after each talk. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom, and I'm not sure if attendees have a chat button or not, but if you put your questions in either of those, we'll pick those up. We'll have a small break in the middle as well for everyone to catch their breath a bit. So we'll get going with our first speaker, who is Iain Gordon, Professor of Mathematics at Edinburgh University, and also Vice President of the LMS. So a great person to kick us off thinking about this. So Iain, take it away.
Thanks very much, Alex. And hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen in a moment. If it's a little bit bumpy, my laptop broke down earlier, and I was very surprised when I came online to find that I had a picture of a giant peach behind me. So there may be other surprises as we go along too. I wanted, first of all, as I just share the first slide, it's to say a little bit about what I mean by looking at things from different lenses. I'll just bring that up. Here we go. And it's in here. No, wrong one. Here. So hopefully you can all see this. I'll move this over here. The lenses that I'm talking about are, if you like, stages of a journey about me trying to understand a little bit about what research culture is, the types of things that help to make it good or improve it, and the role that I or the parts of the institution was in that can help to do that. So that begins with me as an individual, then becoming a principal investigator. So I'm currently a PI on an EPSRC program grant that has a small team around it, including PhD students, postdocs, not only in Edinburgh. For some time, I was head of department in Edinburgh as well, and so there's a role that the head of department sees. I was, or I am now, the head of the College of Science and Engineering at Edinburgh, and that also has a role as a kind of a PVC role within the whole university as well. So I get to see some things from a university point of view. And then finally, the other lens that I want to talk about is being the vice president of the LMS and the lens of the mathematical sciences community that brings to some of this too. And so you can see right at the top of this slide, I sort of half changed what the title was. So it's research culture from a variety of lenses. But the first part is trying to just understand very basically for me what could be a definition of research culture. And this is a definition that was given by the Royal Society in a report about early career researchers about 5 years ago. And it talks about some of the things that research culture encompasses, and also about the way that we are and what our environment is like, the norms, so incentives as well is another way to think about that. And then what effects these things have on people within the community that you're working, and also the whole environment for research. And the reason that I put back up on the top line, I put a brackets S around research culture, I think that what this looks like has common features across all sorts of different academic disciplines, but it also has features that might be specific to certain types of disciplines. And what some of this might look like in a STEM subject might be different than what it looks like in humanities. It might also be that within mathematics, there are some differences than what it would look like in a lab-based science or in engineering. And some of the things that are norms in our community might be really important things for the quality of the community and the work that we produce. And at the same time, some of those might be particular to our community and not necessarily so healthy. And so in our university, for instance, we don't just talk about research culture, we talk about cultures as a way to acknowledge as well that there are things that are different in different disciplines. And although you may be trying to kind of inculcate something which is very, has a lot of commonality between different areas, this becomes an important thing. And I think it is particularly important for mathematics from some of the things that I've seen. And the other thing which is at the back of this, I always have a question, why is this even difficult to do, to build a good culture? And the thing which I have in the back of my head is there are two parts to this. One part is that typically research often is competitive. And so it's competitive because you want to try to publish, and publishing is, there's only a certain number of papers that get into whichever journals that you want to try to publish. There's a competitive nature there. It's quite competitive to try to get a job, to get a PhD position, to get a postdoc, to get a lectureship, so on. And a lot of the things which are hanging around in the background, which are about norms of research communities, reflect part of this competition. And this competition can be good in some ways, that it helps mathematics to keep moving forward. And it's destructive in other ways, because it maybe predisposes certain types of behaviors or certain types of individuals. It makes it easier for them to succeed. And the other part about this as well is that inside universities, and this is a little bit trickier sometimes for mathematics, that kind of individualism that sometimes comes from competition is at odds with quite a lot that's happening now, which is not just about individual disciplines, but many opportunities that are coming up, we start to find sit not only in one discipline, but might sit in a number of disciplines. And so even if you think about some of the things that are happening around AI as an example, quantum as an example, they've got mathematics at its heart. But sometimes it's really difficult if things are set up to be a science that supports individuality, to really get some of those connections and those interdisciplinary things. And no matter what strategy you have as an individual or as a department or as a university to try to help some of those things to work together, strategy is always beaten by culture. And so if the culture continually reinforces individuality or competition, it makes some of these things where it's necessary to work together, either for the environment or for the discipline, harder. So that's another reason in the background, I think, that research culture beyond just the individual is really important, and it's part of the key business of a university as well. So this is about individuals to start with. So the first lens that I want to look at, let me see, is here, is for individuals. Sorry. Right. So as an individual, I think when I started to be a PhD student or a postdoc, or much more as a lecturer, and then somebody who was just thinking about their own research, the only two things to begin with, and really it was actually only one thing that ever popped up for me in research culture, was really the thing about integrity at that point. So what does it mean to be a mathematician who is working with integrity. So some of that is just about, you know, your interpersonal relationships, but it's simply also about learning all those basic kind of community norms about citing in papers, about how you work with other individuals, about giving appropriate credit. It's a little bit more complicated if you start to work with data and things like that. But generally, that was the first thing that that was important to me for research culture as an individual. And that sticks completely now. Without that as a kind of foundation for anything, in the integrity of people in their actions, there's very little about culture that can be built. And I just wanted to highlight, this is the real point where somehow some of the incentives and simply about thinking about what is it you do in the next stage of your job and how is it that you really manage to get your work to be recognized and noticed is the thing which potentially can put that integrity under stress. Given the competitive nature of things, you want to get work out more quickly sometimes, you know that somebody else is working on it, etc., etc. And so that becomes a little bit more stressful. For me, everything that I learned about integrity and also quite a lot about project ethics, I learned as a PhD student really from my supervisor. I was at a time when there wasn't very much extra structure around that, and it was really important. I had a superb supervisor. It was really important that, on the other hand, that I could see that it would be possible with different types of supervisors, you might get a sort of a different type of training at that point. But the integrity thing was absolutely key. Ethics is now becoming, I think, more and more important. And in a sense, it's about the choice of the projects that you might do, is how I would try to explain what that is when you're thinking about ethics and integrity in research culture. The choice of the projects that you might do, some of that will be guided by what is allowable within a university, typically for mathematics, however, or mathematical sciences. Ethics comes up also in the extent to which the types of topics that you work in that might start to stray into more applicable areas as well. And there's a very deliberate thing here that I'm trying to do, which has become more problematic in research culture, at least as I see it now, which is this is separated from the part which is around governance of projects, which includes a lot of the governance which is around the correct use of data and things like that, which feels to me as if that's much more part of a process where something should be really quite clear about what is expected to be done, rather than the individual choice about working on a project or not, where there might be a whole bunch of different ethical principles at play. And you can see that that might historically have been relatively easy in mathematics, but I think with the advent and progress that's happening in AI and in data science, some of the questions that we start to get asked about the projects that we work on change our interactions around that. And then it becomes more important as an individual to be more aware of some of the ways in which to understand different ethical viewpoints and consequences of what one does. There's a really good, I just wanted to point out, if you've not seen this before, a really good resource from the UK Responsible Innovation Organisation. Its website is ukrio.org, the Research Integrity Office, sorry. And they have, for instance, lots of literature about various things around ethics, integrity, and also good governance of projects, including checklists about before thinking about a project, while on a project, and afterwards on a project as well, which are really helpful to try to normalize in some sense what good practice might be that makes sense across quite a lot of different disciplines. And that's something which we use here a bit in Edinburgh and is quite helpful. So from the individual point of view, my intersection, or the way that I think about that with culture to begin with, just as an atomic individual, tends to come across in the ethics and the integrity part there. Then as I was starting to think a little bit more about what happened later to me, the next thing is what I was doing. If I slide this for a minute, I should be able to do that. Yeah, inside as a principal investigator. Okay, so really what's happening at this point is that inside the culture then starts to become much more interesting and complicated. And it's something that many people will come across in their career, which is when you're no longer responsible just for yourself and the projects that you're doing yourself, but you start to get the responsibility for teams. That can be as a PhD supervisor. You start to be responsible much more potentially for a diverse set of people. So I've written students, postdocs. Inside our area, it can be data scientists as you start to think a little bit more broadly outside of mathematics as well. If you're in the humanities, you might have archivists. You're doing things in software developers in labs, you've got technicians. And you start to see at that point that plethora of different types of roles that are really important in order to let research happen, without which it doesn't really work well. And then the responsibilities that you have in order to support that type of work generally, and the opportunities that you have to support those individuals, both as individuals and as doing certain types of roles that are there. And of course, it's really important that these people coming in, they're going to be coming from different backgrounds from you and so on. And so that's also one of the first places for me that I was conscious of a particular responsibility, not just to the generic culture, but to particular individuals. And so that kind of way in which team working started to become important there. I did get training within the university when I did this to begin with. I was in Glasgow. I got training about some of the things and some of the skills that you need as a principal investigator. But also, the point is not to take all of that responsibility on yourself, I think. It also became very important for me that everybody who was in this team was very motivated, very smart, usually very eloquent and so on. And actually bringing in these different points of view from a kind of way of thinking about learning all the time became really helpful to try to understand how to make the research move better. And so it was having that sort of learning mindset, which was kind of quite far beyond what was necessarily just happening in research, but thinking about actually how is this team working? What do we need to do? What is it that the postdocs need in order for them to keep on moving? What is it that's worrying them? How can we help to do those types of things? Leveraging the kind of the things which I think everybody in the mathematical sciences has, which is extreme curiosity, lots of rigor, and that rigor is usually based on evidence. And so if you start to apply that to actually learning about how your team is working as well, it becomes a really helpful and interesting thing. And that's really the first point in my experience where I could start to see the importance of research culture just beyond me being, if you like, a passive recipient of a good environment. That responsibility, and even at the point of the professional development that was there, the previous slide when I was talking about my own situation and learning an enormous amount from my supervisor, that's really what was happening here. Then you take that role as the supervisor and you have the responsibility as well to help to move and inform people about what some of these things look like. So that was that lens which I started to see. And I think that's still a very particular mathematical sciences lens of the types of people that we have, the types of needs that we have. We've all come through somewhat similar systems. We understand how this works for students and postdocs. It becomes more difficult, I think, when you have people who have very different types of career paths. The next thing I wanted to just talk about from the lens of where I started to see research culture was also as the head of department. So I was the head of department in Edinburgh for 7, I think, years. And it's at that point where it's no longer that you really are working directly with individuals to do mathematics or do their research. But nonetheless, I think that everybody would say that the atmosphere or the environment that's in a department is really important for the success of the research and the success of the individuals in that department. And again, I just wanted to point out that absolutely one of the most key things as a head of department at that point was really around the effects of the competition that's around in research, and particularly for people's well-being that's there. So there are a lot of people who in a department may well be in unstable positions, and the instability that I'm talking about is really something that can be to do with the jobs that they have may not be, they may be for fixed term because they're postdocs, they're PhD students, and what is it that you do as a head of department to try to make sure that the pipeline for people's careers then becomes something that whatever it is that they're doing research-wise, they're succeeding in that, but also building the skills and the experience that they need in order to be able to succeed in the next step of what their career is at that point. You also see well-being come up, because even if you are in a permanent position in a department, there will be all sorts of issues that may well be around about how do people progress within their careers within the department, what are expectations that are around there, how as a department do you even begin to talk about those and monitor those, how is it that you understand what's going on with that, what it is that you do again to help with skills and experience. And academic jobs tend to be quite greedy jobs on time, unfortunately, as well. And so you can quickly find yourself, if you're not careful, into a departmental culture that rewards, maybe implicitly or inadvertently, people who are able to work harder than others. And again, that's another form that then starts to reiterate back into the research culture. And how is it that you handle that? What is it that you do that you can support by how you make things as equitable as possible in the department? And also, if you're not careful, those types of incentives that are around lead to poor behaviours as well. And how is it that you get the culture of actually being able to set up good behaviour within a department? What is it that you do in order to make sure that everybody does feel included? And that really, in my head, became a very important thing about both being about the nature of leadership and what you expect from leaders, both in exemplifying good behaviour, but also calling out when things are not right and making sure that it's not incentivized. And also the way in which a head of department, for instance, helps to put in the resources and the structures within a department to help do some of the things that principal investigators need to do, or that individuals need to do in order to help their research. And those little bits of teams work very well together. And so this becomes much more of a challenge about leading people at that point. And you very quickly understand as well that in getting the research culture better, it's really important to be addressing questions that are around EDI at that point. And you have a superpower very often as a head of department that you can emphasize things that otherwise might be underemphasized. So it's not just about putting in the right processes, but you are typically in charge of hiring, for example. So you can do things directly to tackle underrepresentation. So certainly that's some of the things that we've done in Edinburgh, both in helping people who have a strong will to try to make something happen. So at the PhD level, there's something called the Piscopia initiative for trying to attract women and non-binary people in to do PhDs in mathematics. That came out of Edinburgh and Heriot Watt and was vigorously supported. We have various schemes to try to hire incredibly talented people, it turns out, from underrepresented minorities to come in to work with us for postdoctoral positions and so on. And you see as well how the environment basically just, if you're not careful, really makes many more holes in the pipeline for people coming in. So how is it that you address things like that? The canonical things are, of course, stuff like Athena Swan and so on, and the responsibility that you have as the head of department to that. More generally, and this is where I wanted to, these last two slides about how this looks like in a university, why research cultures are important and how mathematics might think about that within that context, they're really supposed to be linked together. The part which is about being a kind of a PVC and the part which is about working for the London Mathematical Society. It's really important that all of the things that we've been talking about need to have the right policy and governance around them in order for that really to become systematized, and not that you need individuals at different points to show exceptional hard work to push something through, or any types of courage and so forth. And so anything which is looking at a university level should already be understanding what's necessary at the individual level, what's necessary at the kind of a small team level, and I should have structures to help departments or schools function very well. And these include things like, as we talked about, career pathways for people. How is the university's policy helping people in all sorts of non-traditional routes, making sure that any structural inequalities are actually called out and worked through? What's the infrastructure that is around? For instance, we talked a little bit about more and more it would be important for us as ethical things and data starts to come up. You need to have the right infrastructure just to make sure you're handling your data properly, etc. And all of these policies need to be also followed up as well to make sure that they are delivered on and monitored on. And that feels very much as if that should be a university trying to help schools or departments, help teams, help individuals to do that much, much better. The critical point that I wanted to point about this is that when stuff like this gets to a university level, it can often be that mathematics isn't noticed as much as it should be. Mathematics does have things which look different than in other disciplines. The rate at which people publish is usually quite different than if you are working in, for instance, particle physics or a lab science. So we look very much like the humanities at that point very often. The way in which we work can very often be in small teams rather than in big teams. You can see that there is a trend in the mathematical sciences, if you look at ref data, that the number of single author papers that are being submitted is reducing and the number of multiple author papers is increasing, but still it tends to be small numbers of people on the whole. And it also tends to be that if mathematics is placed in the science and engineering context, that the types of grants that we get are different in nature. You see that pop up then in the number of PhD students that are available for mathematicians. And so anything which is incentivizing that too much and not recognizing disciplinary difference becomes problematic. And so therefore it's really important, and what happens is that there is a way that mathematicians are able to explain clearly what culture looks like in their own departments in order that that then can get represented at the university level where the systems and the infrastructure are put in place. I've also mentioned it's really important at that point to be able to showcase and communicate what goes on in order to, to make sure that it's kind of self-evident about how the university has these policies, how it is that it follows through in that, and how it celebrates the successes of research culture at that point. And the extra point, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's really important for some of the opportunities that are in the mathematical sciences that we recognize as mathematicians as well, the opportunities that there can be to collaborate with people outside of mathematics. And then the university as a whole may typically make some things easier or harder, again, depending on the incentives or the environment that's around. It's really important in the role that I have at the moment to allow people to be able to meet one another from different schools, not only to share experiences, so you can then understand what culture looks like in different places, but also simply intellectually. And so that gets me to my very last slide, which is the vice president of the LMS. So one of the things that I said that's really important as you're sort of working up through those sort of stages of in research culture of how that's viewed from different points of view, it can be quite easy for the smaller parts, individuals or little teams, or even a department, to be lost as this gets bigger and bigger. And it feels then that that's part of the duty of the London Math Society, events like this, but more generally of the community as a whole, to be good at explaining what are the disciplinary norms that we value, what is it that we think that a good culture looks like, and then to be able to articulate that back to other parts of the academic or the wider community that is interested in this. And so the particular example, for instance, is in people, culture, or environment for the ref. How do we make sure that whatever comes up there is able to recognize what a good culture for mathematics looks like? Of course, the people on the panel should really know this, and they will do that, but you need to make sure at this early stage as well, when stuff is being created and metrics are being created and so on, that these things are able to represent what good culture looks like for mathematics. And then similarly, that's the same thing as what happens in university discussions. It's that notion of cultures rather than culture. And that feels, therefore, that things like this good practice, these meetings, this type of particular meeting, then understanding what different bits of good looks like or what bad things look like becomes really important, not only for our own understanding, but then to be able to articulate that very generally far beyond just our own walls as well. So those are the different ways of lenses that I see research culture in. That was me. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Iain, for a great talk. Lots of really nice talking points there. So if anyone has any questions, please use the Q&A function. I think possibly also if you click raise hand, we'll be able to unmute you. I think we did have a question from one of the other panelists first to kick us off. Annette, are you happy to ask that out loud again?
Okay, I'm happy to. Oh, so hi, Iain, and thanks for that really great talk. Yeah, loads I could talk about. One of the questions I have for you, which is, can you speak into the role of line management in building healthy research cultures and your reflections on the effectiveness of line management generally in universities?
Oh, I could talk for hours about that, but I won't. I'll be brief. So my experience of this has two parts to it. One part was as head of school. Officially, I was line manager to about 120 people, which is too big, right? It doesn't make any sense at all. But a reason for that, in some sense, was where there was sort of some concentration of responsibility and agency at that point. And that was something about the way that the school that I was in charge of was organized. It's changed a little bit. So we had a difference between line management, which would tended to be thought of in some sense as, an order, discipline, all of that stuff, which in some sense, very, very many people are reluctant to take as a responsibility for obvious reasons, because as a community, we often have very collective ways of thinking. On the other hand, it was relatively easy for us in the department to be making sure that what we call the annual reviews were happening for people given by large sets of other people, so that there was that part which was around the development of people. That's also a really important duty of a line manager. That was something that was built well within the department. So we ended up having, I think, a really good annual review system that was challenging in the sense that it would reflect on what you had said that you wanted to do in the last year, and you would have to discuss that, where you had successes, where there had been obstacles, what the nature of those obstacles were, and also look forward into what it was that you were trying to do. And that became a really positive conversation that also included things like promotion discussions and so forth. And so that was a really good part of what line management was. That tended to work quite well. The bit that we found much more difficult was around the thing which was around the calling out of when something wasn't working very well, who it was that was really responsible to do that. It fell to the head of school quite a lot at that point. And we deliberately, however, tried to make the way in which we did parts of continual improvement to be very different than anything that was at all disciplinary, or, you know, you're in the top 10%, you're a red, you're an amber, you're a green, or anything like that. And I don't think that generally in the academic world, we've really, at least in the university that I'm at, it's quite devolved university. And so I think it's certainly true that there's a lot of variation, and it's not usual necessarily to really be very rigorous on some parts of what you would expect. In parts that are around the more obvious parts of culture that have become mainstream, so EDI particularly, I think that that's got much better, that it's clearer what different routes are, routes that go through line management, but also the availability of routes that are adjacent to it, so they're non-threatening or they don't have conflicts of interest and so on. That part has become much clearer and better, as far as I'm aware, and it's under continual improvement. But other things which are day-to-day about, you haven't applied for a grant for the last 25 years, what's going on? That type of thing is a much less common type of conversation at that point, I think, still. Yeah.
Thank you both. So we've got a question from Sarah. Let me see if this works. Sarah, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you. Thank you, Iain, for a great talk. You mentioned at the end shared responsibility, and I think this is really or shared endeavor, and it is really key for me. So you know, culture as soon as culture becomes something that goes into ref guidelines or that is talked about at say university level, staff tend to disengage and think, oh, this is a metric, this is something that doesn't really concerns me. On the contrary, I think that everyone should be really invested from you know, changing the culture or improving the culture, creating the right environment. How would you know, what do you think works? So how do we make everyone responsible, or how do we bring everyone in that, you know, that improving the culture as a collective responsibility?
Yeah. So I can tell you what I've done in Edinburgh. So Edinburgh already, the people, culture and environment stuff in ref, I guess people knew was in the air. We had for some time already as a university a research cultures action plan, which had gone through, you can't imagine, because it's about research culture, it has to demonstrate to the nth degree how consultative it's been and so forth, in order to really be able to not fall at the first hurdle. And that eventually has now started to be delivered upon in the last year. But in the college that I lead, we have appointed a dean, and the dean is called the Dean of Research, Culture and Ref, deliberately written in that order. We used to have a Dean of Ref, but now it's a research culture. And the role of that person for the first couple of years, we'll keep a watching brief on doing some of the stuff we need to for ref, but is basically going to individual schools. We have 8 of them in our college, finding out what they think is research culture, understanding where they might well be doing well or poorly, and that varies from school to school, helping to share the information that's coming from good practice in other parts of the college, and helping to put in place some structures that will help them to deal with some of the issues that they might have. So there may be some things around commonality about problems for postdocs across the whole college, some of which will be specific, some problems will be specific, but there'll be things in common. How is it that we help to support that to happen, share experiences, but all led from the bottom up at that point? That's turning out to be really, really helpful, and already focusing on, for us, some real problems that we have that maybe are replicated in a number of schools. So actually suggest that if you could find a way to bring the schools together to suggest the answers, you would actually do quite well. It's raising the awareness that there are some schools that have already got great and quite advanced research cultures, and that's helping the other ones to understand what good might look like at that point. And that's been a structural thing that we've tried to do to seed the conversations, but it's absolutely critical that those conversations are embedded in what does the culture mean for that school, while at the same time making some challenges, like I tried to say at the beginning, about sometimes, you know, that culture might not be as good as you want it to be in that school. The way that you're dealing, for instance, with ethics, by not dealing with ethics, and actually the world has changed since it looked 30 years ago, or things like that has been really helpful so far. So that has been a success. It's been really important that the person who has that role as well was very strongly embedded in the school beforehand, so understands very well a school view. And that's what we've done here. But I think that there's a role for disciplines themselves as well. So there's a real role for mathematics itself to try to articulate what good culture looks like for us as a discipline.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think with the time, we'll leave it there. But thank you very much, Iain, for a really thought-provoking talk. So